Despite my usual alias of Hawkeye038 in most places, Iron Man has always been one of my favorite characters. I know in a post-MCU world this isn't as niche as it once was, and saying that I liked Iron Man before he was super popular can be just as passé. That said, I've been a fan since I was a kid, mostly due to my love of robotics and my own pragmatic line of thought that if I were to be a normal, non-superpowered human trying to fight supervillains, having a high-tech suit of armor is the most logical response. Of course, this is assuming I have the means and knowledge to create one. Like, whenever they try to do this with Batman, to try to up his arsenal in hype moments, my immediate thought is, I feel like he should just have this around all the time. I get he's supposed to be ninja-like, but once you get to this, or something like the Batman Beyond suit, you may as well just go full Iron Man. Practicality aside, playing as Iron Man in games like Captain America and the Avengers, an old arcade beat-em-up that I had for the Sega Genesis, and the Capcom fighting games like Marvel vs. Capcom 2 sure helped the cause as well, all of which was more than enough to spark my interest in reading Iron Man in the comics. In this day and age, it's kind of hard not to already think of Iron Man, well, with the MCU's massive success, which he obviously helped pioneer, but the Armored Avenger's antics, actions, and character traits have been especially on my mind lately. Probably due to the fact I've been reading the Jerry Duggan run, parts of the current run by Spencer Ackerman, the now Iron Man director of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I'll of course be following up with Matt Fraction's run, to really capture that whole post-Civil War chapter for Tony's life, plus refreshing my memory on the old Ultimate version in Mark Millar's Ultimates, while also keeping up with the new Ultimates version by Camp. Oh, and even though it's not him in the suit, I've also been throwing in some Infamous Iron Man, not to mention that whole Robert Downey Jr. coming back to play Doom thing, which in a weird and totally inaccurate way makes the Infamous Iron Man book more relevant. Anyway, all this has led me to notice a recurring trait of Tony's. Ultimately, it may be his biggest flaw, but yet it's also his most relatable characteristic, at least to me. It's a trait that foils against some of his best allies from both a moral and scientific standpoint, but I also think it's indicative of his engineering mentality. What I'm referring to is Tony's tendency to instinctually compromise. Specifically as a first reaction to overwhelming odds, he'll bend his own morals and or ethics if it means there's a solution to the problem he's facing. I know on the surface that may seem like a wild accusation, like how can a character compromising be a bad trait? It means he's willing to meet in the middle. Not to mention it's generally utilized as Tony making the best of a bad situation. The problem is Tony tends to always default to it, and it puts him at odds with his closest friends and allies, almost all of whom question his decisions and point out there was probably a better way, but this better way tends to be outside of what Tony perceives to be options. These options do exist, but they often require viewing the situation or problem in more abstract ways compared to Tony's more mechanical and logical thinking. In most cases, he always thinks he's doing what's best, but it's a very the road to hell is paved with good intentions type of situation. This trait is actually pretty consistent. It's something that shows up in both the comics and movies, including both versions of Civil War. The most recent version I've seen of this is during the current One World Under Doom event, in which Dr. Doom, after becoming Sorcerer Supreme, has declared himself supreme ruler of the world, with many of the world's governments willingly swearing fealty to the Latverian leader. Iron Man's tie-in issues for said event sees Tony, in his effort to combat Doom, willing to bank a local insurgency just to have a chance at entering Latveria, which, by the way, Doom has erected a magical barrier around. Minor spoilers, but Tony's interrupted from completing the negotiations with this group by Black Widow, who berates him for his behavior while also pointing out that this course of action would have led to more harm than good. Their conversation is a bit long, with Tony explaining his train of thought for his current actions. It's best to actually just check out the whole issue, but it ends with Tony asking for a better plan. Again, this isn't an isolated incident. Back in the original Civil War, during a secret meeting with Cap to try and salvage, well, everything, he explains part of why he's going along with the Registration Act. In this case, it's a matter of the lesser of two evils, claiming that the Superhuman Registration Act was the best case scenario and that the alternatives were far more invasive. When Cap tries to counter that they wouldn't let those situations occur, saying, "We'd fight it, we'd stop it," Tony rebuttals with, "What do you think I'm trying to do?" This essentially sums up his whole rationale and thought process. He thinks he's taking the best course of action after considering all the information currently present to him and what strategies are viable. We also see this compromise characteristic in situations like sending the Hulk to space or dealing with the incursions in Hickman's Avengers run. Now, to be fair, I can't solely blame him for the last two considering they're group decisions done by him and the rest of the Illuminati. That said, I'll be damned if during the incursions discussions he wasn't making some "it's us or them" comments, and he did seem pretty vocal about sending the Hulk to space. Anyway, we could spend all day combing through the character's 60+ years of comics, but it's probably good to shift to his newer portrayal in a different medium. As consistent as this trait is in the comics, I'd say it's equally, if not more prevalent in the MCU. Granted, that may be because there are far fewer films than there are comic issues, so if looking at it as a percentage, obviously one will have a higher saturation. There are a few examples, one of which comes from this version of Civil War, while the others are in Iron Man 2 and in Endgame. I'll discuss the other two when talking about his engineering mentality because I think it fits better with those. For now, let's talk about Civil War and his solution for Wanda, which ruins his chance of resolution between him and Cap. The sentiment is similar to the comic version, in which he again makes a compromise to stave off a worse situation. In his head, he's done his best to please everyone. He's keeping her safe, but not trying to make her feel trapped by confining her to the Avengers compound, which notably is spacious and has various amenities, while also keeping the world governments happy by claiming he has her contained and monitored in order to keep them from being more invasive with dealing with her. Given the variables he has in play, this seems to be the best option, but of course, because of the dehumanizing aspect of it, Cap isn't having it.
I file a motion to have you and Wanda reinstated.
Wanda? What about Wanda?
She's fine. She's confined to the compound currently. Vision's keeping her company.
Oh, God, Tony, every time I think
What,
you
it's
see
100
things the right
acres
way.
with a lap pool. It's got a screening room. There's worse ways to protect people.
Protection. Is that how you see this? This is protection? It's internment,
She's
Tony.
not a U.S. citizen, and they don't
come
grant
on,
visas
Tony.
to weapons of mass destruction.
She's a kid.
Give me a break! I'm doing what has to be done to stave off something worse.
I do want to talk more about Cap's and Reed's perspectives of problem solving and how they contrast with Tony's, but I want to go back and discuss Stark's engineering mindset beforehand. The reason being, I think it's important to postulate where this compromising nature may come from in the first place, which I think will better help show how Stark's pragmatism contrasts against Steve's sort of greatest generation folk hero-like stalwartness and Reed's abstract optimism. Now, what do I mean when I talk about Tony having an engineering mindset? Obviously, he is an engineer and refers to himself as a mechanic, but I think this plays more into his personality than I've seen mentioned before. There are a couple of really great examples of what I'm getting at in the film Apollo 13. One is more direct, but the other also helps supplement. If you haven't seen the movie, spoilers I guess, but it's straight up 30 years old. A fact that I'm just now learning. I straight up did not think it was that old, and now I feel ancient. Anyway, at a certain point in the film, adding to the current disastrous predicament the astronauts are already in, an issue occurs in which they need to find a way to filter out the excess carbon dioxide. There's a bunch of details of why this has become a problem, but the important part is that the guys at NASA have to figure out a way for them to accomplish this task using specifically only the materials that the astronauts have in the capsule.
Well, I suggest you gentlemen invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole. Rapidly.
Okay, people, listen up. People upstairs handed us this one, and we gotta come through. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Similarly, Gary Sinise's character, who is trying to find ways to power up the command module without using too much power, also has to restrict himself to the same conditions, and even makes a point to not even have a different flashlight as to what the guys in space have.
I need a flashlight. That's not what they have up there. Don't give me anything they don't have on board.
Oh, also Big Bang Theory had a sort of lesser version of the initial scene I mentioned. In their case, it was fixing a toilet instead of a carbon dioxide filtering system. Now, I may only be a lowly public health scientist by trade, but I think in terms of hierarchy, space toilet that breaks after 10 flushes is inferior to astronauts being poisoned by their own carbon dioxide. But credit where credit's due. Now, this idea of engineers having to make the best of a bad situation using limited materials kind of reminds me of someone. A certain genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. Oh, what's his name? And what did he do again?
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
Oh, that's right. Thanks, Obadiah. How could I forget? Okay, so I don't want to diminish Tony's genius because the guy is smart, but he's smart in a very specific way. While yes, he's able to build something remarkable out of limited resources, he still needed the resources, or in this case, a very specific box of scraps in the first place to give him a chance. Had he not had Ho Jensen or the palladium to build a small arc reactor, I feel like we'd be looking at a very different solution. Tony has a pretty linear way of thinking. We can see this in the succession of his armors, especially with how he improves upon their accessibility as the movies go on. Again, this shows a very engineering mentality, making improvements and modifications with each iteration. While it is a boon for his armors, it's a bit of a detriment to his problem solving. Let's look at Iron Man 2 for example, in which Stark is dying from palladium poisoning due to the arc reactor in his chest. The thing keeping him alive is also killing him. Stark mentions distinctly to Fury that he has tried every combination, every permutation, and nothing works. It's not until Fury's insistence that Stark venture into his father's archives and Stark's own subsequent re-evaluation of the old Stark Expo layout that the idea of rediscovering a new element dawns on him. I firmly believe that had Fury not pressed him, Stark would have just been stuck in the cycle he was in. Similarly, in Endgame, we see Tony make a logical choice by just making the best of an end result. It's not until the possibility of time travel is presented does he work out the math to do so. However, again, he needs an outside influence to give him an alternative. In a way, he has trouble really thinking outside the box. He can do wonders with a box of scraps, but he needs someone who could think outside of that box and view it for more than it is. Someone who has more abstract ideas to help push him forward. Enter Reed Richards. You know, the type of guy who has the audacity to say, there's no problem that can't be solved. A person whose aim is to solve everything. A man with over 100 ideas. Before I dig into Reed Richards' mentality, there are a couple caveats / discrepancies that I think are worth bringing up. If you're an avid comic reader, you'll probably notice that some of the examples I've used aren't Reed's best moments. Planet Hulk, Civil War, Secret Wars 2015, all feel antithetical to how I believe Reed normally thinks. I think there's a couple ways to explain these, both in-universe and out. On one hand, you can just chalk it all up to different writers and different story needs, which would be fair since a major complaint of Marvel events is that they frequently cause mischaracterizations to push their own narrative. A notable one being literally everyone in Avengers vs. X-Men. Like, no one is on their best behavior here. So for those stories I mentioned, it could just be the case that something needs to happen, so Reed has to agree with Tony, and so writers mischaracterize Reed. Planet Hulk, Marvel editorial really wanted to send Hulk to space, so Reed votes with Tony. Civil War, Illuminati science bros over Cap's underground hose. I don't know. Secret Wars, Marvel editorial really wanted to smash their two continuities together to transplant Miles Morales. Doesn't matter what Reed thinks he can do, it's happening. Of course, I'm joking. I'm sure they're more thought out than this. I will say, even though I don't fully agree with Reed siding with Tony, at least in story, there's an attempt to explain why he's going this route when it feels like he normally wouldn't. It's a brief conversation Sue has with Tony regarding Reed and things Tony has him doing during Civil War. Tony tries to shrug it off, proclaiming Reed's a big boy, implying he's capable of making independent decisions free of influence. To which Sue counters that Reed isn't, especially when he's around Tony. She points out that Reed idolizes Tony and thus implies that Reed's choices become biased or skewed. Now, I could see why this could be a bit hard to get on board with, especially if you're an FF fan. Like, why would Reed, who is smarter than Tony and has stable relationships, both romantic and platonic all around, idolize someone who constantly puts his relationships through the ringer and often gets in his own way? It doesn't add up on paper. The only way that I can see Reed idolizing Tony is by the way in which Tony gets to be a spectacle without it being a burden. All the science, money, and popularity, and like a third of the responsibility. This page from Wade's run comes to mind. All of the effort Reed goes through to stay on good terms with the public actually serves the greater purpose of staying in the good graces with his family. Whereas, while yes, Tony does shoulder responsibility for his actions, his fame and fortune aren't part of that equation. So I could see a bit of a grass is greener on the other side type of situation. Tony gets to enjoy the fruits of his labor, where Reed is always digging deeper. I feel like this is presented to us visually as well. There are numerous images of Reed buried in his lab trying to solve what's next, whereas a lot of Tony's inventions are reactionary. However, I do think there's a bit of truth in there that gives it merit. I know that was a long detour for a behavioral discrepancy, but we're back on track. Now let's tie this in more to Tony's compromising nature versus Reed's more perfectionist approach to science. Part of Reed's story originally was searching for a cure to his family's, more specifically Ben's condition. I believe currently his focus is on trying to have Ben's powers function more like the rest of the FFs, where they can utilize it at will. In contrast, if Tony were Reed, Stark would find a way for them to just live with it. For example, Tony just makes Rhodey a cybernetic brace instead of curing his spine in the MCU. Tony learns from his mistakes, that bit we've seen on Tony's armor upgrades throughout the MCU, but Reed probably would have realized half of these upgrades should have just been incorporated initially. Now I know this can be misconstrued as Reed smart, Tony dumb, and that's not the point I'm trying to make. While Tony's compromises often have negative repercussions, they're at least acted upon or realized. Reed could have 1 million ideas, but who knows how many he'd actually get to. And before anyone brings it up, I'll present this example of Reed making a tablet with infinite storage, but being bought out by Sony to not bring it to market. In a weird roundabout way, this actually kind of proves my point. While yes, this is a Reed idea coming to fruition, I can see Tony coming up with a version that makes a compromise. It may not function as well as Reed's, but he'd find a way for it to still be leagues better than what's on the market, while also being profitable, whereas Reed would rather have it at its full potential than have it be compromised. And I get it, Reed was paid off to not put it on the market, and I'm not saying that he couldn't come up with one that's also profitable. I just think Tony would be more inclined to do so. And more importantly, I think Tony would come up with one that would have some sort of like planned obsolescence that, you know, wouldn't disrupt the market in the way that Reed's would. One more Reed example before we move on. Admittedly, this is meant to showcase Reed's genius, but it can't be ignored what it says about Tony. This one comes from the Dark Reign Fantastic Four miniseries, which served as a primer to Hickman's run on Fantastic Four. During these issues, Hickman introduces Reed's invention of the Bridge, a device that lets him view other realities of the multiverse. This will eventually lead to him meeting the Council of Reeds, but there's something important he discovers along the way. As he's viewing these different realities, he starts comparing events. It's important to note that this series took place after Civil War and Secret Invasion, and occurs, as the name suggests, during Marvel's Dark Reign, in which Norman Osborn is head of Hammer, which was formerly S.H.I.E.L.D. Essentially, Marvel's current superhero status quo in universe has seen better days. After such trying events, one of which Reed was heavily involved in, he's curious to see if similar events happened in other realities and how they were remedied. To his discovery, not only did they happen, but the ones that had peaceful resolutions were the result of his influence. In particular, his independent influence. Independent of dilution or compromise from Stark or Pym, he literally says, no more compromising with inferior ideas, and if you haven't been paying attention to the thesis of this video, that's kind of a big deal. Again, this is likely intended to be an example of Reed's capabilities and not an indictment of Tony's, but the contrast can't be ignored. Additionally, you can view this with a less scientific lens, that the compromise that Reed is distastefully referring to is that he betrayed his own morals and went against his better judgment in problem solving in regard to Civil War, and it's not referring to Reed's science being compromised. There's a lot to unpack here. Reed himself even questions if it's arrogance that he could be this paragon of problem solving, or if it's merely honesty meeting responsibility. Either way, I think it still makes my point that compromising is part of Tony's nature, and probably always will be, but with Reed's perfectionist nature, compromising just holds him back, or more importantly, it holds his ideas back. However, that nature only works for Reed. I feel it's also worth mentioning that only other Reeds could show ours that he's thinking too small. My point is, the way that Reed solves issues doesn't work to most regular people. All in all, Reed would rather spend an eternity trying to perfect a solution to a problem, whereas Tony understands the impracticality of it. It's also why I think it works that they tend to bounce ideas off of each other. If we framed it as, let's say, making a movie, I could see Reed being the crazy director trying to get the perfect shot, frame, take, scene, you name it, and wants to keep it all in the film, while Tony would be like an editor or producer, someone who points out the budget or resources or hard cuts. He'd have more of an understanding of what's possible within the given parameters, while trying to get it as close to what Reed's vision actually is. Reed would try to give us Dune, uncut, with every subplot in the 70s before audiences are ready for it, and it would be like 4 hours long. But Tony would give us Star Wars with the understanding of what elements need to be kind of streamlined for mass appeal, but not lose the essence. Lastly, it's also worth mentioning that there's such a thing as too much of a good thing as we see the implosion of the Council of Reeds. I know the point of Hickman's run was to reconnect Reed with his family and let them share in his vision for a better future. However, I think I can kind of co-opt it a little bit to say having Tony around isn't the worst thing. Hey, this is Future Josh Editing. So I just saw the Fantastic Four movie and personally really loved it, but I also just want to bring up that it does actually kind of support what I'm talking about here between Tony and Reed. So in the movie, don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it or anything, but Reed, you know, like Tony, does see all the options, right? He even sees kind of the dark path that you could take, but here's the thing, Reed has this sort of undeniable optimism that there's always another way, right? He even says that like verbatim, that I'll find another way in the movie. The only problem is time's just not on his side, and that's kind of usually the case with a lot of these situations that both these characters find themselves in. And that's where like Tony's thinking kind of comes in handy, where it's, you know, practical, that it's like, hey, this is what we can do, and so that's what we should do. Where Reed's like, no, I can figure it out if you just I just need more time. I can figure it out. And so even in the movie, again, I'm not going to spoil what actually happens, but, you know, at that point, Sue's like, there is no other way. This is our only option with what we have. So in that kind of case, I think Tony's rationale is the sort of more appropriate thing. But yeah, it's just kind of like spinning it on his head, where sometimes with the way Reed thinks isn't always the best. But again, the issue here more at hand is that Tony's really quick to sort of jump to this compromising nature, whereas Reed is sort of endlessly, you know, hopeful and positive, and just kind of really thinks that he can fix it no matter what. Now, moving on from the science and back towards morality, let's review Tony's relationship with Cap and the way their ideologies combat each other during Civil War, comic version. Now, let's rewind back to that secret meeting I mentioned. I think this highlights how Tony's moral compromises are more relatable than his scientific ones. It might be hard to fathom the idea of not thinking up a solution when you're as smart as Reed or Tony. I do think we are more understanding when someone does something with the best intentions, but it doesn't turn out well. Tony says to Cap, "You're the perfect man. You live by ideals and standards that are more than outdated. They're impossible for anyone but you. And when confronted by the shades of gray, when people inevitably disappoint you because people are flawed, you do what you've always done when the going got tough. You dig in your heels and fight even harder. Never mind whether you can win. Sometimes I think you'd rather go out in a blaze of glory than face reality." To which Cap rebuttals that the thing that he hasn't been able to adjust to is the damn psychobabble used to justify actions, and what's right is what's right, and stand up and fight for it. Now, obviously Cap isn't incorrect. There is a difference between right and wrong, and he should stand up for the former. However, Tony understands the human condition better. We all want to be Cap, to give the good fight 100% of the time and fight as hard as we can for what's right. And we may get it right a lot of the time, but the truth is we just tend to fall short sometimes. I do think Tony has a point that the ideals are impossible to live up to unless you're Cap. You know that speech Cap gives about planting yourself like a tree and saying, "No, you move." In the MCU, it's said by Sharon Carter instead during Peggy Carter's funeral.
And she said, "Compromise where you can. But where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move."
It's a great speech, simultaneously aspirational and inspirational, but its main message is also a hell of a lot easier to pull off and stand by when you have super soldier serum coursing through your veins. I also find it a bit ironic that in the Sharon Carter version, the lead up to Cap's quote actually includes advice consisting of compromise where you can't, don't. Going back to that secret meeting, Tony also brings up that the resistant group that Cap is leading is largely doing so out of loyalty to him, where the registration group would easily be picked up by Hank or Reed. Now, Tony says it's because they don't want to disappoint Cap. The implication here being that Cap's resistance is largely based around just one man's ideals, or more simplistically, loyalty to just that man, while Tony and the Registration Act are an ideology or a movement. Comparing the two sides, one runs the risk of dissipating or fizzling out if the main figure is taken out of the equation, whereas the other has enough backing that it feels inevitable. It's a lot less centralized. Tony may be spearheading his side, but he's not the reason it exists. While Cap may not be the only one who would form a resistance, he's by and large the only one with enough clout and moral righteousness that people would agree to follow. Alright, full transparency, this is just plain conjecture at this point. My own interpretation of the fuller idea Tony is expressing. Basically, I feel that he's also pointing out that some of the others just don't have the same moral fiber to keep everyone in line and rally the cause the way that Cap can. The reason I bring this up is because I think it's more relatable to see someone who has to flex or compromise their morality, not all the time, but definitely in high tension moments where there doesn't appear to be other options. I know this is like a basic ethics / philosophy way to frame it, but it's like the would you steal food to feed your starving family problem, where it's like, yes, stealing is wrong, but I need to do this for them. Cap's instinct would be like, no, there's a better way, which is admirable, but again, it's also a lot easier to have this attitude when you're the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, wrapped in an American flag super soldier. We all want to be like Cap, and should try to be, but chances are, depending on the situation, we may be closer to Tony. And before anyone brings it up in the comments, I know that Steve already has this mentality and high moral fiber way before he has the super soldier serum in him, but again, that's the point. That's the thing that makes him the exception, not the rule, the thing that really makes him a superhero and kind of better than the rest of us, which in turn reinforces why Tony's more relatable, which is my point. This is a small pivot, but there's this moment in Matt Fraction's Hawkeye run where he's talking about how when Cap is around, he brings out the best in people and it makes you want to be good, but then points out to the landlord Ivan that Cap isn't around, implying he doesn't have to be on his best behavior. Hey, this is Future Josh editing. Just one more for the road. So I came across this panel while rereading Jonathan Hickman's Avengers during issue 2, I believe. I thought about putting this actually in the engineering section, or like Tony's engineering mindset, I should say. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting dichotomy more specifically between him and Cap. So even though this section's talking about their sort of morality and like Tony's kind of compromising his own morality, I do think it's interesting to kind of view their problem-solving dichotomy, that even something as simple as rebuilding or sort of building up the Avengers team for at the start of this run can really highlight the difference between the way that each of them approaches a problem. Alright, so if we take a quick look at this panel, you'll see that Tony's assuming the way that Cap's viewing this problem, saying that knowing you like I do, you'll see this as a state of mind and attitude to be adopted and spread to the others through words invoking deeds. Sayings like greater threats mean greater needs. You know, that sort of folksy, call to action, greatest generation sort of vibe that Cap brings to any occasion. And then Cap replies with, fair enough, I'll admit to that, but I'm assuming you're seeing this as some sort of math problem. And then Tony literally says, an engineering one actually. So I just kind of feel that really solidifies my point on Tony having this engineering mindset, but also I think it really highlights again this sort of dichotomy between the way that each of them decides to approach a problem. You know, one views it as a sort of mentality or mindset, and then the other views it as an engineering thing that needs to be tinkered and fixed and manipulated like a machine to get it to function properly. Now, you might look at all this evidence as me portraying a minor character trait as a major character defect, or worse, just punching down to Tony. If you've been viewing Tony's compromising nature as only a negative, or if I've convinced you that it is, you shouldn't, and that wasn't my intention. I know I'm framing this piece with this compromising nature as a flaw, but that doesn't mean making compromises is negative in itself. It's more so the fact that Tony is quick to lean on this method, often putting him at odds with his peers, especially in the spheres of morality and science, and yet never learning from the experiences. But the fact of the matter is that life is short and it's human to make compromises. It's important to remember that the other aspect of this video is something we can relate to. We can't all think in the abstract way that Reed does to try and solve every problem, nor can we always have Steve's moral fiber every second of every day. We can only do our best, and sometimes we fail. Sometimes we let fear in and guide us towards less than ideal choices, and sometimes life just gives us a bad hand. I think for most people, we're just doing our best to make it out of that cave with our own box of scraps.
The box of scraps!
Thanks, Obadiah.